And so why does this matter? Well, I think for a Christian, and if you're a Christian, you'd say, well, you got to believe in the soul, right? Because you're a Christian, and you imagine that you're going to go to heaven when you die, and so to do that, you're going to need a soul to get there, right? Let me see. Start my time, right? So you basically got to believe in the soul if you're a Christian. And I always think it's a good thing to know why you believe things. And so if you say you believe in the soul, you should probably know why you believe it, especially if someone's going to ask you about it. Especially, in this day and age that we live in, lots of people, don't believe in the soul and don't think it's the right way to believe it. So, and if you're not a Christian, I still think it's important to think about the soul, because the soul is so important to who we are as individuals, as persons, as I would say. If we're just kind of a sack of atoms that just exist, that's much different than saying you're a soul with a body. It adds maybe a certain level of value, and so it's just important to contemplate those things, I think. Now, in order to kind of get started on the actual argument, we got to talk about some definitions. And this is probably the most boring part of the presentation, so I'm sorry about that, but it's just super important to be all on the same page. So the first thing we want to talk about is substances. Now, substances are basically just a bunch of individual things. So, for example, I'm a substance, or a dog is a substance. Maybe a baseball, a box of cereal, things that you just think of as an individual thing. Substances are also continuing, which just means they exist through time. So, for an example would be, I can be thinking about philosophy 5 minutes ago, and then thinking about math 5 minutes later, and I'm still the same person. A dog can bark 5 minutes ago, and then he can go chase a ball, and he's still the same dog. The third one is they're not in other things or had by other things. And so what that means is, let's say, for example, I can't be in Stephen, my friend over there. It just doesn't make any sense. And neither can Stephen be in me. That doesn't really make any sense either. Now, properties, which we'll get to the next definition, they are in substances, meaning like there's certain characteristics about that. But where can I be inside of my dog or something? That doesn't even make any sense, right? 4, they're unities of parts. So this one's pretty commonsensical. We have arms, we have legs, we're a unit of parts. 5, they have causal powers. And all that means really is I can do things. I can lift up my hand, a dog can bark, a ball can be thrown. We can do things. Now, properties, on the other hand, properties are what we would say is universal, meaning they can be in multiple things at once. So for an example, an apple can be red, but also that dude's sweatshirt can also be red. But it's the same red. It can exist in different things. It's universal. Properties are also what we'd say as immutable. I think I'm saying that word right, meaning they don't change. So for example, a leaf would change to the color red in the fall, but it isn't as if green somehow turned into red. No, we would say the leaf lost the property of green and gains the property of red. Number 3, properties are had by other things and are in other things. So think of properties as characteristics of something. So for example, I'm wearing a red shirt. So my shirt has the property of being red, or maroon, really, that's my favorite color. Or, let me think of another one. That table is white, so it has the property of white. So properties can be in other things. And also, so I'm trying to save the questions for the last 15 minutes. So if you guys have questions, try and wait till that. But if you're completely lost and you really need something, raise your hand and we can talk about it. It's okay. You guys all have the slides in front of you, so we can get back to them. That's okay. The next definition we want to go over are events. And events basically are what you think they are. So they're temporal states that occur in the world. Temporal means time, so they exist in time. So for an example, a lightning strike would be an event. Me sweating as I am right now is also an event. But events are dependent on the properties of the event. So if I'm sweating right now and I don't have the property of sweating, then I wouldn't be sweating right now, right? So if a lightning strike happened, it would have to have the property of a lightning strike hitting a tree for it to be a lightning strike, or a car, or a human, or we don't want to think about a lightning strike hitting a human, but you know what I mean. So that's that. The next thing you want to talk about, and you guys, if you guys have ever taken a philosophy class, or if you've thought about this before, really this big idea of the soul really has everything to do with the mind-body debate, which is just asking, are we our brains? Is the brain the same thing as our mind? Are they two separate things? And so generally there are two views out there, and there are more. If you guys get into this, and I have some recommendations in that book list that talk about different variations of views on this topic, but these are the main ones. We have physicalism, and then dualism, and then dualism kind of branches off into substance dualism and property dualism. And I'm going to go over those here in a bit. But generally, these are the main ones, the main views out there. So, physicalism. Now, physicalism, basically it's in the name of the view. You guys get one. Physicalism just basically says everything in existence is purely physical. There's nothing mental whatsoever. We are our brains. That's all that there is. We are not souls or anything like that. But when the physicalist says that, they're committed to three things. So they're committed to physical properties being publicly accessible. And so what that means is nobody is in a better suited place to know what a property is. For example, physicalists would say you can know everything about something through a third-person perspective. So you can take my brain and you can say, this is exactly where he has the emotion of nervousness, because I'm nervous right now, right? Or he has the memory of riding a bike. The physicalist can say, this is what it is, exactly what it is. It's publicly accessible. They also would have to commit themselves to what is known as being spatially located. So all that means is you can measure it. You can measure physical things. They are somewhere for you to see, for you to feel, sense, do an experiment on, that type of thing. I'm going to look through my notes here, because I'm kind of going quick. The next one, does that all make sense, being spatially located? Basically think of it as like you can measure it with a ruler or something like that. The last one is material objects don't engage in teleological behavior. And teleological, really all that means is you're doing something for some end. You have a goal in mind. So they would say a rock doesn't have the goal of turning into a diamond if it has such pressure placed upon it. The rock just turns into a diamond if it has a lot of pressure on it due to the natural order of things. The rock didn't have the goal to turn into a diamond, that type of thing. Now, in contrast, we have dualism. And dualism is the view that genuine mental entities exist. Like there are some things out there that are not physical whatsoever, and that's what we have. And so a couple examples of this would be sensations. So for example, maybe having the experience of seeing red. For example, you have that experience of seeing this cup or this drink is red. I have that experience. Maybe pain would be a sensation. So if you get maybe a shot at the doctor's office or something like that, that would also be a sensation. Now sensations happen at particular times. So for example, I can see red if I see an apple. Like I can have the experience of seeing red if I see an apple. But if I'm daydreaming, like I close my eyes and I'm daydreaming, I feel like I can have the experience of red. Like I can think of the color red, if that kind of makes sense. Let's see here. Sensations are also dependent on their felt quality. And all that means is, for you to have this sensation, you have to have the felt quality of that sensation. So maybe you feel heat, like it's warm out. So you're having the sensation of being warm. That sensation wouldn't exist unless you indeed had that felt feeling of being warm. It presupposes consciousness. So a rock, for example, doesn't have any sensations, right? Because it's a rock. It has no perception. It's purely physical, all that type of thing. But sensations presuppose, or they have to have some sort of thing to be perceiving them for them to exist. know I'm going really hard on sensations, but that's a really big thing, so yeah. Now, propositional attitudes are basically the attitudes you have for something. So for example, I might dread driving on the snow, or I might fear that there's a tornado watch, or I might love my girlfriend or something, right? There's a certain attitude towards that proposition. Now, a couple key points on those is the attitude itself. So I might have the fear of maybe driving on the snow, but that's totally different than maybe my fear of God, for example. Let me think of another one. I had, oh yeah, my hope that it rains tomorrow is much different than my hope that my girlfriend loves me back. Do we all kind of see that, right? And the next part of a propositional attitude is the, I guess I kind of just talked about it, the proposition itself. So like my hope that it doesn't snow tomorrow is much different than my hope that Sarah and I will get married one day. That's it. So that's a general mental
I hope to.
Eventually, sorry. I'm trying to think of examples.
I do love him back. I do.
So the next one is an act of free will, or what we would say is purposing. All that means is you're trying to do something. So, for example, I'm trying to raise my arm right now. I have the free will to do that. Now, it's important to realize that even if what I want to do is stop, so for example, if someone comes over here and pulls my arm so I can't lift it, then my will, I'm still acting on free will because I'm still trying to do it, right? So the outcome doesn't have to be substantiated if I'm at least trying to do it. Does that make sense? The next one we want to talk about is a desire. A desire is a felt inclination to do something. So for example, this morning, I woke up at 6:45 and I had the desire to not come here today because I was super tired. And this will come back on. So that would be just a felt inclination. Or maybe you have the desire that, I don't know, we'll see how that goes. I have the desire that this won't mess up. That's the desire. And thoughts are just occurrent thoughts, maybe things that cross your mind. So I might have the thought that, I could have benched a little bit more yesterday. But that doesn't entail that I actually believe that. So like I can think that, I can think that the world is flat, but it doesn't mean I believe that the world's flat, right? That thought could just cross my mind. We kind of went over beliefs. Beliefs are just things that you believe, and it's very commonsensical, I think. Now, when we talk about dualism, there's two different branches of dualism, or at least what I'm talking about here. And the only difference is property dualism is the view that there are only mental properties, but every substance is physical. So for example, I am entirely my brain, but my brain might have a mental property that kind of comes out from my brain. It kind of supervenes, much like smoke would come out of a flame or something like that. Now, substance dualism would say that we are mental substances. We're not physical. So we have a soul or a self. If you guys read philosophy books, a lot of philosophers will use the term self instead of soul. And they do that they don't want to use like a religious connotation or something like that. Doesn't really make any sense to me because we're talking about the same thing, obviously. But they would say that you are a soul and you have mental properties from your soul, but your soul also interacts with your brain as well. I mean, when I'm stressed, that's going to interact with my brain that to send signals to my heart to start beating faster. So my soul can be connected to my brain, but it is in no way my brain. So that's the big difference there. So the next thing that I talk about is Leibniz's law of indiscernibility of identicals. And so Leibniz, let's see here, or Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, he was a German philosopher, but he was also a theist. So he came up with this law that says, if x equals y, whatever is true of x is true of y, and whatever is true of y is true of x. Basically, if everything true about me is also true about Austin too, we would be the same thing. Now, for example, in contrast of that, let's say I'm 5'9", maybe 5'8". Let's say I'm 5'8", and Mason's 5'7". We would not be the same thing, obviously, because there's something true of me that's not true of him. So we would not be the same thing. But it's also important, I had down here, even if you can find one thing that's possibly true of X and not true of Y, even if it's not actually true, then they are not the same thing. So if I'm 5'9", it makes sense also 5'9", but it's possible that I'm 5'10", it's possible that he's 5'8", we still wouldn't be the same thing. Does that kind of make sense? You have to have, like, it can't be possible that there's something that's different about us. If that makes sense. Now, there's a super important piece for physicalism to make its case. It's got to say that everything that's mental has everything that's physical. So there's nothing true of a physical thing that's not also true of a mental thing and vice versa. So that means if there's a difference between those two things, they're not the same thing whatsoever. And so that's where we're going here. So the first argument that I have here. Now, a lot of these arguments that I get from books. And you'll see if you read The Soul by J.P. Moreland, this is where I got all of this basically. Well, not all of it, but a lot of it. You'll see I get them from books, which is why it's so important to read. But anyway, but this right here, I kind of came up with on my own. I think it's pretty good. But I'm going to be arguing for property dualism, which, just to remind you, is the view that conscious properties and events are mental, not physical. Now, it doesn't mean that we're a mental substance, but it does mean that at least consciousness, our mind, is mental. The reason why I'm arguing for this is because while I am a substance dualist, and this is a topic about defense of the soul, obviously, I think it's important maybe to start somewhere where we argue that there are mental things. I think then we'll be more likely to say, well, we do have a soul, and there is something mental. And if you ever want to talk to somebody that maybe doesn't agree with you, I think this is a good place to start. So here's how it goes. If there's one thing true of a mental property or event that is not true of a physical property or event, then they are not the same thing. And this is, I think, is very commonsensical. If there's something different about them, they're not the same thing. There's at least one thing true of a mental property or event that is not true of a physical property or event. Therefore, they're not the same thing. If they're not the same thing, then there are genuine mental properties and events. If there are genuine mental properties and events, then physicalism is false and property dualism is correct. Therefore, property dualism is correct. And I think the big premise here, the one that we want to be able to defend, is the second one. Because everything else just validly goes through the argument deductively. So I don't think there's any problems. And if you guys do find any problems with it, let me know and we can talk about it. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to defend premise 2. So property dualists argue that mental states are in no sense physical because they possess 6 features that are not owned by physical states. All right, the first one, there's a raw qualitative or feel, or a what is it like having a mental state, such as pain. So, for example, when I'm in pain, I have this sensation of being in pain, right? We've all been in pain at some point. Maybe somebody has pain right now, right? It could be emotional, it could be physical, if Sarah doesn't love me, maybe it's emotional. But anyway, but that's much different than maybe boiling at a certain temperature, which is a physical state. Boiling at a certain temperature has no, what is it like to it? There's no sensation there. A neuron, a brain cell, or a nervous cell, has no sensation. It might cause something, and it might go somewhere and send electrical impulses to the brain and so on and so forth, but it's not thinking about philosophy, right? It's not like, oh, I feel pain right now. No, you feel pain, but the neuron does not. So that's something that's different. Mental states have intentionality about them. So, for example, I can think of a lake, or I can think about a cat. But a physical state, maybe a thunderstorm or something, isn't about or of anything. A chair isn't about or of anything. There's nothing that's thinking about, nothing like that, but a mental state is. Number 3, mental states are inner, private, or immediate to the subject having them. And this one is like my favorite one, right? Because physicalists say that you can basically know everything through a third-person perspective. You can know everything that's about a person by studying their brain and so on and so forth. But this says that mental states are inner, private, and immediate. And let's think about that, right? So me as myself, I know what my emotions are. I know what my thoughts are. I know what my memories are. But if we look at my brain, maybe we take a CT scan of my brain, you can't know that. And even if technology comes up to where, oh, we know that maybe this synapse is this thought, so on and so forth, I'm still in a better position to know that thought just through my first person awareness. A scientist would have to go through all these barriers to even get to that. Even then, they still don't know what I know, right? Because I'm the only one that can have my thoughts. Nobody else can. And if somebody could have my own thoughts, that would be their own thoughts, because they're the ones having it. You know what I mean? So that's a very important thing, I think. Mental states also fail to have crucial features about them. So spatial extension, location, being composed of parts, that type of thing. So pain is an incredibly complex neural phenomenon. There's so many parts, there's so many cells, atoms that have to work together for you to experience pain, for pain to reach your consciousness. But when you're in pain, it's very simple, right? When I'm in pain, I just want to sit there, I'm a baby, I want to take medication, I just want to chill out. It's simple, I'm in pain, nothing about it. But when you get down to the cells and the atoms, it's so complicated. You have to measure it, you have to know where it goes, you have to know, is it maybe psychological instead of neural, that type of thing. So mental states don't have this. For example, another example would be, we can say maybe where a thought might be in the brain. For example, a lot of planning, like thoughts and planning, would be in your lateral prefrontal cortex. However, you can say maybe that's where the thought is, but that's only really where the neurons are taking place. The thought itself isn't in some lobe somewhere, right? And I'll get more onto that in the next slide. But mental states, I gotta keep pressing this. Mental states are also constituted by self-presenting properties. And all that means is, so when I'm looking at that table, I have to be aware of my sensation of looking at that table. I basically have to rely on my mental faculties, is what I would be calling it. Like, I have to rely on my retina, my eyes, my brain, all that stuff. But the sensation itself, like, I don't need to have second order awareness that I am indeed having the sensation of seeing that table for me to have that sensation. That's really all that means. But physical properties, you do need to have that mental sensation to understand, to see them. But mental sensations themselves, you don't need to be aware. Like, I don't have to sit and be like, am I aware that I'm seeing that table? No, you don't need to be aware of that, because if you see that table, you see that table. Does that make sense? Number 6, some sensations are very vague. I'm gonna do that because sometimes it does that. Vague physical states are not vague. I will never forget, in my neuroscience class, my professor, he was saying how memories, all they are neurons firing in the exact same way as when you had the experience. So for example, my memory of riding my first bicycle, he would say that experience that you're having of that memory is simply the neurons firing in the exact same way as you had them when you first rode that bicycle. And the reason why memories are vague is because sometimes those neurons don't fire correctly, and sometimes not all the neurons fire. I remember thinking to myself, because this guy obviously is a physicalist, right? He'd say we are our brains, as a lot of neuroscientists do. I was thinking about that, and I was like, there's nothing vague about those neurons firing. You can go into my brain, a CT scan, look at my brain, know exactly where those neurons are. You can measure them, you can see the impulses from them. Maybe not all of them are firing at the exact same time, but there's nothing vague about those physical states. And if they were vague, how could science even develop and figure out what they are, right? Like, there's no way. But the memory is vague, so it's different. So there's something different about that. Thus, if even one of these are possibly true, then we have grounds to say that physicalism is false and that we are not just physical things, and that consciousness is mental. Now, there's an objection, and I think that this is an important one to talk about. How much time do I got here? So, dualists say that thinking events, this is just an example, thinking events are not spatially located, even though the brain events associated with them are. And physicalists say thoughts, after all, are located in certain segments of the brain, which is true, right? It is true. I talked about this a couple minutes ago about the lateral prefrontal cortex holding a lot of your planning ability. But the dualist can say correlation and causation does not equal ontological reality. So what that means is, sure, maybe the brain events are associated, or they might cause it, the mental event to occur, But by no means do they have to be the exact same thing. Does that make sense? So they might be correlated and they might cause it, but they're not the same thing, right? Because they have to have everything true of a mental event or a mental entity, anything, is also true of a physical entity, and there can't be any differences. We just talked about 6 of them. And it's super important, I think, to realize, if you guys study this yourself, neuroscience is a great thing. It's a great field to go in. You've got a lot of science in there that maybe you can help people in diseases and things like that. But science is utterly neutral in the mind-body debate because of this very fact. Correlation and causation do not equal ontological reality. So you can say something causes something, but that doesn't mean it is that something. And so when you hear people, and people will say this, well, neuroscience disproves the soul, or neuroscience disproves the mind, or whatever, that's dumb, because they're presupposing that there's some ontological reality there, that they are the exact same thing. Maybe I shouldn't say dumb, but you guys know what I mean. So now we go on to phase 3, arguments for substance dualism, which is the one that I really want to argue for, and it's the one that talks about the soul. Let's see here. What do I got? Here we go. All right, so as just a reminder, substance dualism is the view that we have a soul or a self that is not physical. So all these arguments that I got from basically J.P. Merlin's book on the soul. So if you want more information, you should definitely read that. It's an amazing read. Definitely agree with it. But this is one argument such that he has presented. So he says, I'm essentially an indivisible, simple spiritual substance. Any physical body is essentially a divisible or complex entity. The law of identity pertains. This is just saying the Leibniz law that we talked about earlier makes sense, it's true. Number 4, therefore I'm not identical with my physical body. 5, if I'm not identical with it, I'm not it, I'm a soul, therefore I'm a soul. Now, 2 through 6, completely valid, completely logical in my eyes. And if you have thoughts on it, we can talk about it or whatever. But I think the big one is that first one. I'm essentially an indivisible, simple spiritual substance. So we want to really defend that view. So take this thought experiment, for example. So I stand right here and I see that table. Now I walk closer to that table, and every time I walk closer to that table, I have a different, what is called a phenomenological, what is it called? It eludes me. Perspective or image of that table. So I'm experiencing that table through different images as I'm walking closer to it. Right? It's the same table, but I am walking to it. Now, when you think about that, you notice one thing. You're the person having that experience. You are the person having that experience. It's not as if you are just a bundle of experiences, which some philosophers do argue for, I disagree with, because to have an experience, you have to have someone having the experience, right? So it's somebody that's having it. Secondly, you realize that you're continuing through time. So as you get closer, you're having the experiences of seeing this table, but I'm definitely blocking this, I'm sorry, but you're continuing through time, so you're the one still having those experiences. And you realize to yourself, I am one thing, right? There's nobody else in this head. If there is, maybe we should think about that a little bit more. But anyway, but so there's only one person there, for example, right? Now, our body has so many different parts. So did you know that if you cut your brain in half, the half that's not cut out that's still there will just take up the duties of the other half? That's amazing. That's an amazing thing. But you still have half of a brain. The brain is still half. But you are not one half. You are still one thing. You can chop off my arm. I'm not 4/5. Yeah, if you count your head, 4/5 of a person anymore, right? I'm still one person. Because that's really all that says. I am one thing, but my body is not one thing. So therefore, I'm a soul. Number 2, if I were a physical object, then a third-person physical description of me would capture all the facts that are true of me. But a third-person physical description does not capture all the facts that are true of me. Actually, I think this is kind of insulting, but we'll go with it. 3, therefore, I'm not a physical object. 4, I'm either a physical object or a soul. 5, therefore, I'm a soul. And again, I think the 2 premises, the 1 and 2 are the big the bigger deal here. All the other ones kind of logically flow. But again, if you guys have any questions about it, we can talk about it. But this is super interesting and super important because for physicalists, like I said earlier, they believe that a third person description of you would capture everything about you. So if they do a CT scan of your brain, they can know everything about you just through that CT scan or whatever. Am I even using that? Yeah, I'm using that. So they would say, an example would be, okay, so if a physicalist was standing over there and they were doing a description of me, they would say, okay, there's a body over there that's approximately 5'9", 145 pounds, brown hair, he's existing over there by the, whatever direction this is, by this wall or whatever. That's what they would say about me. Or if they looked at my brain, they'd be like, okay, this guy has this brain here, this lobe is right here, this lobe is right there, whatever. That's what they would say about you. But that doesn't capture my volitions, my emotions, my memories, everything that makes me me. Nobody can get at. A third person description can't account for the subjective first person awareness that you have of yourself. If that makes sense. So you can't capture, and I said it was insulting because it is kind of insulting for someone to say you are just a sack of atoms and I can know everything about you just by studying your brain chemistry. Try, all right? I got some things locked and loaded in here you don't even want to know about, okay? So, try me. All right. This one says, I'm a physical object, then I don't have free will. But I do have free will, therefore I'm not a physical object, for I'm either a physical object or a soul, therefore I'm a soul. This one, super interesting, because the debate on free will, oh my goodness, you could have arguments upon arguments, you could have books upon books just on free will itself. I put this one in here because I think it's very commonsensical for people to have free will. If you didn't have free will and you weren't able to choose, I feel like that would just not be a fun time because you're just like, well, I know someone's making me do all this. Why did I even exist? Why can't I choose to not exist? Anyway, so that's basically what it says. Anyway, but if a physical object, so if we're just purely physical objects, so think of like a rock or maybe this phone, for example, as I'm checking the time. This thing doesn't have free will or choices. It's completely subject to physical and natural laws, like a rock or a tree or something like that. They're completely subject to things around them. They can't control, they can't do anything. And so they don't have free will. And that's what we would be if we didn't have souls. We would just be a sack of atoms, basically subjected to the cruel natural law that we have in this universe. That's basically all we would be. Furthermore, I want to talk about this, because I think this one's even more interesting. If we don't have souls, determinism is true, and that's kind of what I just argued for. However, if determinism is true, then we don't have moral obligations. And so what that means, if I don't have the choice to do otherwise, like if I don't have the choice to not murder a child or sacrifice a child or whatever, then you shouldn't hold me accountable because I didn't have no choice. I had to do what I had to do. You have no moral obligations there. Therefore, if we don't have souls, then we don't have moral obligations. And this is just through a valid form. If you come to the next session, we'll talk about validity and logic. But this right here is just from these two premises. Therefore, if we don't have souls, then we do not have moral obligations. But it's so essential to our lives. Obviously, we have moral obligations. If someone sits here and tells me they don't have a moral obligation to save a child that's about to die and falling off a tree, I'm gonna look at them funny. I'll be like, no, you need to get out there and you need to do that. You need to take control and you need to do that. If someone sits here and tells me it's okay to kill a child, or I don't know why killing a child is an example that I'm using. I'm trying to think of something terrible. Yeah, genocide. Like if you're sitting there telling me that it's okay to commit genocide, we need some help there. So clearly moral obligations, we have moral obligations. But if we do have moral obligations, we have souls. And that's how the argument goes. I just think that's so fascinating. Because no one talked about this in this conference, but the moral argument for God's existence, incredibly smart, incredibly amazing. You guys all should check it out. Anyway, that's my little tidbit. Number 4, this one's also super interesting. If something is a physical object composed of parts, it does not survive over time as the same object if it comes to different parts. My body and brain are physical objects are composed of parts. Therefore, my body and brain do not survive over time as the same objects. My body and brain are constantly coming to have different parts. Therefore, my body and brain do not survive over time as the same object. But you do survive over time. Therefore, you're a soul, you're not a body. So let's think about this thought experiment. So let's say in different backyards you have planks, wooden planks that are labeled A through E or whatever. And they're in multiple backyards. Now let's say you put all the planks in one backyard, you stack them up on top of each other to form a heap of planks, a heap of boards, or whatever. And they, now they're one thing, but the only thing that's making them one thing is their relationships to each other and the boards themselves. Now let's say I take out B, the board B, and replace it with the board F. Now there's only A without, I'm totally missing it. Letters elude me. So you have, so there's no B, but you have A and then C through E there. But instead of B, now you have F or something like that, right? But the point of the matter is still the same thing. Is that the same board or the same heap of planks? I would say no, it's not. Because the only thing that makes that heap of boards, the heap of boards, is the relationships with each other, which now they have different relationships because there's different boards, and the things themselves, the boards. And now there's one different board. So it's not the same thing. And we can argue about that all you guys want, because different philosophers say different things, but I think it's still important to maybe look at it like that. But our bodies, our brains, change cells, change atoms so many times. Like even just right now, my skin cells are coming off. Maybe that's a little nasty, I'm sorry. To think about. But, you know, your cells die all the time. And we come out different cells. Therefore, our bodies changes, but we don't. Now, someone might argue, well, then I don't survive over time as the same object. And some philosophers actually do debate this. I think it's illogical, but they do debate this. But if that were the case, how could I do math, for example, right? So Austin 1 is doing addition, 1 plus 1 equals 2. Okay, so maybe 1 minute later, it takes me a long time to do math. Austin 2 does 2 times 4, and then Austin 3 does, it equals it, so it equals 8. Now, how is it that I know what Austin 1 did if I'm not the same person? How would I know that? There's no way, because it's a different person. It's the same thing with language and sentences. Let's say I say one sentence and I get to the subject of the sentence. And then a couple moments later I get to the verb of the sentence. When I get to that verb and I'm a different person, I have no idea what this verb even applies to, because I'm not the same person that talked about the subject. So clearly we're the same person over time, and clearly our bodies are not the same thing over time. Now there has been some breakthroughs in neuroscience. I will say, I don't know all about this, so I don't even know if I want to talk about it. I won't talk about it. If you guys want to talk about it, we can. Okay, now that I have to talk about it now. So that was my own fault. Yeah, right. So they will say there is a certain bundle of neurons that maybe exist throughout your entire life. And some physicalist out there is saying, well, that's consciousness, that's the soul, that's who you are. Okay, then why is it that I still think of myself as one thing? And why do I not think of myself as a bundle of things? Because if that were true, if a bundle of neurons were to exist throughout our whole life, I would think of myself as a bundle of neurons, of many things, not just one thing. So that doesn't really work either. Okay. So we get to my favorite argument, and this I think has just a lot of philosophy behind it. Super cool, you guys should definitely read this. So it goes like this. I'm a substance, I call it Swinburne's argument because Richard Swinburne, other people have really put out stuff like this, but this is his specifically. It starts out like this. I'm a substance which is thinking. 2, it is conceivable that while I'm thinking, my body is suddenly destroyed. All that means is it's conceivable that an outer body experience occurs. Number 3, it's not conceivable that I am thinking I do not exist. Therefore, I'm a substance which it is conceivable, can continue to exist while my body is suddenly destroyed. That just comes straight from these premises. It is inconceivable that any substance can lose all its parts simultaneously and yet continue to exist. Therefore, I'm a soul, a substance whose only essential property is the capacity for thought. So let's just go through premise by premise, because this is kind of a complicated argument, I think, if you're first looking at it. It's still a complicated argument for me, actually. I'm a substance which is thinking. Yeah, try and deny that. Because you're going to think to try and deny that, which means you're proving that point right there. So that's really undeniable. You are a substance which is thinking, because to deny it means you're thinking about it. Number two, it is conceivable that while I'm thinking, my body is suddenly destroyed. And I think that's the most complicated premise. So let's think about conceivability. What does conceivability mean? Conceivability means it's logically possible. Now, what is logically possible? Oh, you have a question?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay. What does logically possible mean? If you go to my second session, we'll talk more about that. But briefly, logical possibility means there's no contradiction in the idea. So, for example, a round square is logically impossible. That means not even God can make a round square. It can't happen. It can't occur. Another example would be a triangle has two sides. That's not logically possible. There's a contradiction in the idea, because to be a triangle, you have to have three sides, right? A married bachelor, logically impossible, because if you're a bachelor, that means you're not married, and if you get married, that means you're married, so they can't be the same thing. So that's logically impossible. It means it entails a contradiction in the idea. Now, so let's re-say this. Is it logically possible that while I'm thinking, my body is suddenly destroyed? So is there a contradiction in that idea? And so let's think about that. So there's a bunch of research out there on near-death experiences. And when I first read about that stuff, I was like, bruh, this ain't true. Okay, this is so far-fetched. That was really my own naturalistic bias. But the more you read about it, the more there's so much out there. But even if you don't think it's true, sure, you don't have to think it's true, but you have to at least admit to yourself that there's something going on here, that these people believe that when they're on their deathbed, they have somehow left their body and now they're looking at their body on the bed. You have to at least admit that, right? And so that's grounds for thinking it is logically possible. There's no contradiction. Because if there were a contradiction, we wouldn't have all the evidence in the research that we have about it. And so what this is saying, oh, hey, it's my reminder that Sarah loves me.
Nice.
I don't have any emotional pain, so that's it. And I think that's going to stay there unless I do something about it. Complete. Anyway. Oh my gosh, yeah, it's so funny. Where was I at?
I think you're conceivably thinking about asking her to marry.
Yes, that is a logical possibility. Thank
Right
you.
now?
Anyway, that would be funny. I don't have a ring. I also don't have a job, so. There's that. Anyway, so.
Nice.
Where was I at?
So sweet.
We at least know that it's logically possible that I'm thinking my body is totally destroyed. That's all this argument needs for it to work. All it needs is that it's possible. It doesn't need that it's true. It just means that it's possible. So if it is logically possible that I'm thinking I do not exist, therefore I'm a substance which is conceivable can continue to exist while my body is suddenly destroyed. That just comes straight from these premises right here. Now, it's inconceivable that any substance can lose all its parts simultaneously and yet continue to exist. Again, I think that's very commonsensical. If you automatically just vanish out of thin air, every part of you is gone, you'd be annihilated, there's nothing there anymore. But the very fact that you can exist when your body is destroyed means that all your parts weren't destroyed, right? And so what's the part that wasn't destroyed? Well, your soul. Your soul wasn't destroyed, so therefore you have a soul. Favorite argument, it's amazing. Number 5, and I put this in here because I thought it was super cool. Consciousness and the existence of God. So philosophers have really developed this argument. I mean, a number of them have developed this argument that say, if we have consciousness, we have grounds to think that God exists. And so there's different arguments for this. I'm doing the inference to the best explanation. And the inference to the best explanation, all that means is we have a good explanation of it, a better explanation than maybe someone else has of it. So I'm trying to think. So for example, if I'm sitting at home and I see tracks that look like a small dog's tracks, I probably think it was a dog. I wouldn't think it was a dragon, right? But I'm making an inference to the best explanation of that. It would be a dog, not a dragon. Dragons don't even exist, right? that's what this is doing. And so it goes like this. There's data that must have an explanation. Mental entities exist. So for this argument to work, you gotta at least believe that mental entities exist. And I think we have good grounds to believe that because we talked about it earlier. Either naturalism explains it better or theism explains it better. Now these are the main views I think out there on the topic. Naturalism, I don't know if you guys know this, naturalism is the philosophical worldview that there's no God, there's no supernatural things that exist. Everything that exists is purely physical. The Big Bang happens, we evolved from matter, now we're just a sack of matter arranged in different ways, basically. There's no room for a mental thing to exist through that story, right? There's nothing mental about that story. It's all purely physical. And so we have naturalism, can't explain it better than theism. And I have a quote here. Because even naturalist philosophers will say, man, it is a surprise, and it's kind of radical that consciousness exists in the first place, that the mind exists in the first place. Even them themselves admit that. Whereas a theist would say, we wouldn't be surprised at all that consciousness and minds exist. Because God, before physical matter, was just that, an unembodied mind. Yeah, exactly. So we have an example right there. We have God right there that says, we should be surprised that we have minds, because we're made in God's image in the first place, right? And God is a mind, so we have an example there. Naturalism doesn't have such example. In fact, it really presupposes that there shouldn't be any mental things that exist in the first place. So therefore, theism explains it better than naturalism. Thus, theism provides an inference to the best explanation of the data, so God exists. I went over that super briefly, but in the book, Consciousness and the Existence of God by J.P. Moreland, it's in your guys' book recommendations. Highly, you should read that. Super good. Implications for Christians. With the soul comes the possibility of an afterlife. And so now, this shouldn't take the place of your faith. And it shouldn't take the place of, the Bible and everything like that. You need to have faith in God. That's like first and foremost, obviously. But there is philosophical data and reason to believe that there's an afterlife. So maybe you have loved ones that have passed away, or maybe you're scared of dying yourself. You at least have other reasons to believe that you're going to exist after death. It's not just faith. Not that faith is not enough, right? But you have other stuff. Also, this adds to the idea of a supernatural world, including God. We just talked about the consciousness and the existence of God. It adds support to the idea that supernatural things do, in fact, exist. This adds value to the human person. If all we were just a sack of atoms, what makes us different than, a rock? What makes us any different? The one thing that makes us different is that we have a soul, and that's super valuable and super important that God did that for us. Okay, now we can talk about questions. If anybody has any questions. We have, what time is it? Yes.
Yeah, so looking back at phase 2, defending premise 2, you talked about this raw qualitative feeling and how a third party could not really entirely or exhaustively evaluate your physical state of things. But I think that, from that perspective, which would kind of be like the naturalist or the physicalist perspective, it's not that anybody believes that they can or that anybody can, but in theory, if you had exactly perfectly the same arrangement of atoms, you could reproduce the same person. So I guess I just want to ask about, that perspective that it doesn't seem to me that anybody's actually saying we have the tools or the science to do this, but that in theory it's, if you could reproduce it, right?
Yeah, so that's a good one, because what's the term? With the idea of the soul comes the idea of identity, and I think that's where you're really going at, right? There's this idea of identity. So, for example, and that's Richard Steinberg goes through that in his book, but the idea of, let's say you have Alexandra, and you put up her brain, half of her brain, and you put it in Alex, and then you put it in Xandra. are they Alexandra or are they different or whatever? Is that kind of what you're talking about? So like you're saying it's completely possible that you could rearrange everything and be the same person? Is that kind of what you're saying? Sort of like off?
One of the things you had mentioned in let's see. So, and maybe the defining premise too, maybe that wasn't the right slide I'm thinking of, but basically, or unity in first person perspective. A third person physical description does not capture all the facts that are true about me.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that they would say, yeah, we don't have the tools or the science, to be able to actually analyze every atom and its orientation in your body, but if we did, it would reproduce the same person and same feelings and thoughts and emotions and all that.
Yeah, I've heard that before. Different people have said, if at some point maybe technology could be possible that we would be able to know, well, this synapse of this neuron and this neuron creates this thought, for example, and then at some point technology will be able to catch it and we'll be able to do this. I still don't think that's a good point. That's a really good argument though, because we'll always be in a better suited place to know our own thoughts than somebody else. I mean, just by direct access, first awareness, or self-awareness of each other, of ourselves. Like, we don't need, does that make sense? I'll have to think a little bit more on that, but.
Yeah, it just seems like they'd say, that's right, the best person will always be yourself, but only because I don't have the tools to perfectly analyze all of it.
Well, even if you had the tools though, you'd still be able to do it through what we talked about earlier, self-presenting properties. Like you're gonna be able to know just like that. You're gonna be able to be aware more so than somebody who isn't you. Like, I don't know.
I just think about I was just telling my wife about twins and themselves. I mean, they are individual people with different souls.
Yeah.
Yet they can sense when something is different about that other person that's so closely tied.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's a good point. Great.
To link our first session with this session, if in fact the original copy of the Bible and Paul says that to be absent from the body is to be with the Lord, then the fact that the Bible is inerrant and we are, once we die, we go to be with the Lord, does that not prove that there is a soul because our body is here?
Yeah, I would say so for sure. Yeah. Now somebody would say, well, you're a Christian, of course you're going to believe that. But I think when you go through inerrancy and you go through all the other existences of God in the Bible itself, like you're on way more solid grounds than simply a Christian believing that. And to your point, what's your name?
Josh.
Josh. Okay, that's a very good point. So, and in fact, Richard Swinburne's book, Our Bodies Are Souls, which is on that list, he talks about that. So he says, will science ever be able to explain the soul? And honestly, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't quite remember all that on the top of my head. So I would refer to him in that book. But that's a really good point. I still hold true to the fact that I know my own thoughts better than somebody else. Shane, I saw your hand.
I forgot where it's at in scripture, somewhere in New Testament letters or whatever. I think somewhere it says, who can know the mind of another man or something like that, and who can know the mind of God except for the Spirit who dwells in. So to your point where you really can't fully know somebody, scripture says that, so there is going to be, even if it's just super duper small, there is going to be something that you will not know about another person because you do not have their mind.
Yeah. For sure. What's me?
Have you heard of the God gene? It's researchers have just said that they have found a gene in the person's body that causes them to be more or less spiritual.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I think I have heard that. Yeah, that is interesting.
So would that, if that were true, would that be a relation to the soul?
I think probably. I think that'd be a reasonable assumption to make. What I first thought you were going for with this is some atheists have said, well, we have the God gene, so that's why you believe in God. That conclusion does not make any sense. In fact, it actually goes the other way. If we do indeed have a God gene, then it means there's a God that wanted us to be in a relationship with him. So if there were a God in the first place, of course he'd make it like that, right? We would want to be with him. He would want that to happen. So that doesn't really make any sense, but that's a really good point. I think quite possibly because we're made in God's image, and yeah, I think so for sure. Jake, did you have one? Or was that?
I was just going to add to the rebuttal to Josh's question on that, was the value of the context of personal values. So science can evolve and grow into that point, but the context of personal value is a scientist can have technology to see that memory or view of something, but they don't have the context of what we produce individually, that thought of, hey, my dad's teaching me how to ride a bike. They're not going to have that personal connection and understanding, whereas, like you said, with the individual complex of that, we get that personal point to it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. For sure, because like you had maybe that connection with your dad or mom, whoever taught you to ride a bike. You can't really measure that connection with using science. You know what I mean? I mean, maybe you can I say biochemicals or something like that, but
Well, you can make similar connections.
yeah,
But not the same.
Correct.
Yeah.
I think if it's fear, if it's pleasure, if it's anger, hate, all those things can be measurable.
yeah.
But I don't think they can be equally.
That's a good point.
I'm still trying to figure out how to articulate this, but I'm kind of trying to understand better the separation of soul and physical that I feel like is being talked about here. Therefore, I'm not a physical object, I'm a soul. And just looking at, like, observing people, like I've watched people in my life that as they get older, they start to go through dementia and Alzheimer's, and they basically become what I think is not who they are. Like, they just, like my grandmother eventually got to a point she just sat there. She didn't, I don't know that she had any thoughts. She didn't recognize anything. She never experienced happiness, like she never smiled. She never got surprised by anything. So those sensations that you talk about, she, you know, if you hit her or something, she would have the pain reflex, the survival part. I don't know what her sensation would be. So I guess part of me is trying to figure out if it's not both physical and soul together in some way, because your personality and who you are yourself can change by these physical changes that happen in your brain as you age.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think there's a reason why we have new bodies when we get to heaven. You know what I mean? And when you look at these near-death experiences, people, they exist in this sort of disordered state where they aren't really full, they're not really whole, that type of thing. And I think that kind of screams at the idea we do need bodies. The way I see it, in the way that I've been taught, you are your soul, so you're the driver in the car. But if that car breaks down, like your brain breaking down, you don't have the biochemicals and things like that, you're not going to be able to drive very well, are you? Right? And so your soul isn't going to be able to function all that well. Because remember, they're interconnected, like you said. And so, yeah, I mean, I agree with that. We definitely are like a connection of it. I think we do need that. We do need that.
So, last question.
I'll just share this with you because John's in the room and he shared it with me because we both have parents that have Alzheimer's. And the comment that John made to me that I thought was really insightful was that the soul isn't gone; it's just pushed way down deep, and it's harder to see that. You know, now it's easy as when we're alive and we're moving and that we can sometimes see each other's soul and kind of just understand the way we are together. But when a person has Alzheimer's, it seems like that soul gets pushed really far down.
Yeah.
And every once in a while you'll get a glimpse of it, and it'll be such a affirmation that it's still there.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that'll help you, Lisa, but it helped me at least. So thank you, John.
Yeah. That's a good point. Thank you for that. So I think that's going to be it, 'cause I think you guys got to get on to your other thing, because we started a little bit late. So thank you guys so much.